You know, there was a science fiction story called Lambda 1 in a book of that name, edited by John Carnell, which tells of an alternate universe where the inhabitants of a ship go insane. It's a very interesting story and typical science fiction in that what is magnified is violence. But what if the inhabitants of this spaceship suddenly went happy instead of went sane? So here we have an interesting use of language. Two people are talking and they say, "Did you hear about old Joe? You know he went mad?" That was the English way of putting it, of course. I don't know quite what an American would say, but we have other things these days. People say, "Did you hear about old Bill? He went sane." It sounds kind of funny, even though it's something I've heard many times before. It still makes me smile. Perhaps because there's a sweetness behind this and it's an idea of healing. A person who has gone sane has, in other words, recovered. And comedy is about recovering a balanced view of life. Now, I made up a joke a while back for a friend of mine, and I present it today to our producer and to our audience with love. This is almost a true story. Almost. Very close. Based on real events, as they say. So once upon a time, excuse me, I should never laugh at my own jokes, but just what can I tell you? There were these two psychiatrists, and they were at a conference, and they were discussing a very special case with which they'd had to do. This was the case of a person who, for the first time in history, exhibited all the mental illnesses listed in the diagnostic manual that psychiatrists use, the National Dictionary of Diagnostic Mental Symptoms. Neuroses, affective, anxiety neuroses, obsessive compulsives, he had them all. Psychoses, yep. Bipolar, schizophrenia, that's cognitive and affective disorders. Yep, he had them all. Character disorders, yes, he had them all. There's, let me see, sociopathy, psychopathy, and and then there was borderline personality disorder, and he had them all. So these two psychiatrists, and they were really getting into it, saying, you know, we don't know quite what happened to that guy. Probably, Lord knows. I mean, they probably gave him electroconvulsive therapy until his brain was pickled, and then put him in a closed ward, or in Middle Ages, he would, of course, have gone into a zoo. Just as they were getting into it, a third psychiatrist came up and said, "I know what happened to that man. I found out." So the two of them were eager for the news. They said, "Well, what did happen?" They said, "Well, he solved all his problems." They said, how could he possibly solve all his problems? He said, "Oh, he became a psychiatrist too." And that's the end. About 10, 12 years ago, maybe 15, 20, I had devoted a lot of my life to studying science and math, although that gives a slightly misleading impression, I should say, to our students, because I grew up in a household that was extremely rich to the point of being drenched in the arts, particularly literature, and in the humanities, in history and drama and entertainment and so on. I didn't really need to study those things because they came with the milk and the breakfast and the lunch and the dinner. But I do remember that one day I was reading a poem, The Lotus Eaters, by Alfred Lord Tennyson. And it talks about the gods looking down neglectfully on the calamity of humanity. It talked about their heedlessness of the praying hands. And I thought about this and I thought, I'm going to start using this as a symbol for the failure of religion today to have any relevance to the human condition. And so I began a course, which I taught in Oklahoma, Sancta Sophia Seminary, for a few years as a graduate course, called The Order of the Spiritual or Sacred Artist. And now I'm ready to turn that into a school for comedians. Where we differ perhaps from other comedy schools, if there are any, is that we want our jokes to be the best, of course. And to use a word I coined in a story a while back, to be the healingist, or the healingist. In other words, we want a school of love that gives people, through comedy, a chance to be a blessing to themselves and each other. When I created this program, and I actually consecrated somewhat around 100 sacred artists over the years as part of a community, I had in mind, in the back of my mind, that if people could dedicate themselves to things like Christian mission, couldn't they dedicate themselves to being artists too, without any particular religious viewpoint? Spiritual in the broad sense, yes. Well, I got into that, and over the years, round about 1988 to 1993, I had the chance to study something I'd always enjoyed learning about, and that was movements in the arts. And in England, probably other parts of Europe, maybe in some parts of America, it's almost considered to be part of being a well-cultured person to be able to reel off these names, even if you don't know what they mean. Names like this: Impressionist painters, Romantic poets, classical composers, Expressionist artists. And then comes the end of the 19th century and a sort of a hinge, a turning of the ages. Something happens. Art seemingly goes mad. And we can see in the book, The Meaning of Modern Art by Herbert Reed, or Sir Herbert Reed, I should say, as he ended his days, what he calls a cleansing of the psyche by a lot of what seemed initially to be sheer nonsense. You can see in the movie The Titanic, the latest one with Leo DiCaprio, directed by James Cameron, you can see a sideswipe at this realm written into the script, where the bad guy, who is the ostensible fiancé of the Kate Winslet character, is a businessman and she is an artist or art student, and he sees something and says, well, that's rubbish or trash for that. And she says, what is this man's name? Because he's going nowhere fast. And she says, Picasso. And we associate Picasso with a movement like Cubism. He has this painting, Les Demoiselles Avignon. Personally, I think it's always a good start to get some partly clothed women into the picture. It makes every artist more likely to succeed. But in his case, the use of dimensions in the portrait was one of those things that gave us the idea of Cubism. But the idea that the human personality can shatter into fragments in Picasso's way is actually an early derivation of what was dawning then to be quantum theory, which is foreshadowed, I think, in the work of people like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne.